I stood by the window and looked out at the endless swamps of Louisiana that stretched to the very horizon. The humid air was so thick that it seemed like you could touch it. Crickets filled the evening with their monotonous sounds, and the wind gently rustled the old branches of the oaks. The swamp lived its own life, and it always reminded me of how the past never truly dies, remaining alive in the depths of our minds. Today was a special evening. I had felt it since the morning, when the sun had barely risen above the horizon, painting the sky a crimson hue. It was a premonition, but what it warned me about, I didn't know yet. I was still trying to cope with thoughts of James, my husband, and our fading marriage, but that wasn't the cause of the strange feeling in my chest that hadn't left me all day. It all started a week ago when I received a message from Carter. We hadn't spoken in over 10 years, since he left for New Orleans. I couldn't understand why he decided to reappear in my life. Maybe it was a coincidence, or maybe he always knew that one day he would have to return to Louisiana, to the place where it all began. From the moment I read his name on the screen of my phone, something inside me stirred. I couldn't even call it excitement. It was more like a foreboding of trouble. We agreed to meet tonight at the old bar by the lake. I chose a dress, not too short but tight enough to accentuate my figure. It was a strange feeling, dressing with such attention to detail, knowing that I was meeting someone who was once a part of my life, but who was now a stranger. I looked at my reflection in the mirror and thought, why am I doing this? James was home, but he barely paid attention to me. We had been together for almost 8 years, and in that time, much had changed. The love between us seemed to have faded away into the swamps that surrounded our home. Before, we always talked, laughed, shared dreams, but now our communication had been reduced to short phrases and empty gazes. It was like the heavy summer air. With each day, it became harder to breathe. He was busy with something on the veranda, his favorite place, where he always spent evenings with a bottle of whiskey. I could have told him that I was going to meet Carter, but something held me back. Not fear, more like a reluctance to acknowledge that this meeting meant something. I left him, absorbed in his thoughts, and went to the car. As soon as I drove a few miles down the road surrounded by oaks, I felt the tension in my chest beginning to ease. I knew these roads like the back of my hand. Every bump, every crack in the asphalt was familiar to me from childhood. But tonight, everything seemed different. Even the air was different. Heavy, filled with something elusive, as if it knew more than I could comprehend. I arrived at the bar a little earlier than the agreed time. The light from the windows barely pierced through the dense canopy of the trees surrounding this secluded place. I parked and got out of the car, feeling the fine droplets of humid mist enveloping my skin. My legs trembled slightly, but I decided it was just nervousness before the meeting. I couldn't make myself go straight inside. Instead, I took a few steps down the road and stopped, listening to the silence. Seconds stretched like an eternity as I waited. The anticipation awakened memories. The time when Carter and I were inseparable. We were young and foolish, not understanding where life was leading us. He was my best friend, and maybe even something more. But then everything changed. His move was sudden, and years of silence followed. I tried to forget him, to build a life with James, but apparently, a part of me never let go of that past. When Carter finally appeared, I recognized him immediately. He had changed, but his eyes, those same ones filled with some deep, hidden fire, remained the same. He approached me slowly, as if testing whether I was ready for what we both knew was inevitable. "Hi, Lily." His voice was low, calm, but I heard the same tension in it that I felt within myself. "Hi," I replied, trying to keep my voice from trembling. We exchanged glances, and at that moment, I realized that I couldn't predict how this evening would end. We entered the bar together. The dim light of the lamps on the ceiling reflected off the old wooden tables, creating a cozy yet strangely unsettling atmosphere. It was as if every corner of this place knew more than I could understand in one evening. Here it smelled of spirits, cigarette smoke, and something that reminded me of days long past, of a time when life seemed simpler. Carter chose a table in the corner, away from the other patrons, who seemed not to notice us. They were absorbed in their own affairs, conversations, beer, and cards. We sat across from each other, and for a moment, silence reigned. I didn't know what to say. We both knew that the meeting wasn't accidental, but I was still trying to convince myself otherwise. It's been a long time. Carter finally broke the silence, not taking his gaze off my face. I nodded. My mouth was dry, and it seemed like the words were stuck deep inside. All my thoughts were jumbled, like wet autumn leaves in the wind, and I couldn't arrange them into a logical order. What could I say to someone I once knew better than myself, and now, it was as if a stranger stood before me. "What brought you here?" I finally asked, gathering my thoughts. The words sounded colder than I intended. Carter smiled slightly and smoothed his hair back, as he always did when he was a bit tense. I remembered that gesture, and my heart skipped a beat for a moment. "Honestly, I don't know," he said, looking at me with that same openness that had always been his trademark. "Maybe I just missed home. Maybe you." Those last words evoked mixed feelings in me. On one hand, I knew that this meeting wasn't accidental. On the other, I wanted to keep my distance. I knew that meeting Carter again brought with it something more than a friendly conversation. Between us, there had always been something deep, unspoken, but powerful, like the undercurrents in the swamps of Louisiana. "Does James know you're here?" His question was asked in a matter-of-fact tone, but I felt the tension in the room increase. "No," I replied curtly, trying to maintain my composure. "He doesn't need to know. It's just a meeting." Carter nodded, and I noticed how the corners of his lips slightly lifted in a faint smile. He always knew how to read me better than anyone. I suddenly felt all my resolve beginning to dissolve. Inside me, a fire was igniting that I had long tried to extinguish. "I'm glad you came," Carter said. His voice was quiet, but it held something warm, familiar, and dangerous. It was that warmth that I hadn't felt in my life for so long. The waitress brought us each a glass of whiskey. I took a big sip, hoping that the alcohol would help me relax. But instead, it only intensified the strange feeling in my chest, a mix of anxiety, anticipation, and awkwardness. I couldn't ignore the fact that there was something in Carter that drew me to him like a magnet. We started talking about trivial things, about old friends, about life in Louisiana, about how everything had changed over the years. With each new topic, our conversation became more relaxed, and the tension between us more palpable. I felt his gaze on me, every time it stopped on my eyes or slid over my figure. It was a subtle but relentless attention that once again brought to life in me what I had long buried under the layer of routine life with James. "You've changed, Lily," he said suddenly, interrupting the conversation about our mutual acquaintances. I froze, feeling his words pierce me. "You too," I replied, smiling slightly, but in my head, everything was spinning. I had changed, but how? And when? Carter leaned in a bit closer, resting his elbows on the table, and his eyes pinned my gaze. "I still remember the girl you once were. Passion, zest for life. Where did she go?" I didn't know what to answer. His words opened something painful in me that I tried to forget. He was right. I had changed. Life with James, the house, the swamps, the routine days, all of it had extinguished the fire in me that once burned brightly and unrestrainedly. I had become a shadow of the woman Carter knew, and he knew it better than I did myself. "She's still here," I said quietly, trying not to betray the tremor in my voice. "But maybe she's just too tired." Carter looked at me for a long time, and I saw understanding in his gaze. At that moment, I realized that we were both standing on the edge of a precipice, and one more step, and we would cross that boundary that I had promised myself never to cross again. We sat in silence for a few more minutes before I decided to stand up. I knew that if I stayed here any longer, I might make a mistake that I couldn't fix. "I have to go," I said, not looking at him. My hands were trembling as I took my bag, but inside, I felt the tension gripping me, not allowing me to leave. "Lily," Carter's voice was soft, almost pleading. "We both know this isn't just a meeting of old friends." I stopped halfway to the door, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. He was right. We both knew it. Returning home, I felt the tension and guilt coiling into a tight knot in my stomach. The night was dark, and the road ahead seemed endless. The headlights of my car barely illuminated the wet track, and the air was already filled with the scent of rain. Thick clouds gathered over the swamps, forming an impenetrable blanket. I saw the reflection of my face in the rearview mirror, but it was not the face I would have recognized 10 years ago. The woman returning home after meeting Carter was different. She carried the burden of guilt and uncertainty. A storm raged within her. Carter's words wouldn't leave me alone. We both know this isn't just a meeting of old friends. He said it with such certainty, such clarity, that I couldn't resist this knowledge. We really did know that there was something more between us than friendship, but could I allow myself to admit it? When I pulled up to the house, the light on the veranda was on, as always. James was inside, perhaps still sitting with a glass of whiskey in his hand, lost in his thoughts, just as dark as the night sky. I slowly turned off the engine, listening to the silence that surrounded the house. Silence had always been a part of our life, and this silence became heavier, as if someone unseen was pressing on my chest. I entered the house. The smell of tobacco and alcohol hit my nose immediately. It was the already familiar scent of our evenings. James didn't turn around when I passed by into the living room. He sat in the old leather chair, a glass in one hand, the other hand holding the remote, aimlessly switching channels on the TV. "You're late," he said, not taking his gaze off the screen. His voice was even, but I felt something more than just words pass between us. He knew that I had gone to meet Carter, even if I didn't say it. Even before I left, he sensed it, and that unspoken force of silence that hung between us became even more unbearable. I got held up. I replied quietly, not trying to hide the weariness in my voice. I went to the kitchen, feeling his gaze burning into my back. Inside me, conflicting feelings were boiling: guilt, anger, fear. I looked at the man who had been by my side for so many years and realized that I no longer knew him. "How was your evening?" James suddenly asked, his voice sounding innocent, but there was a note of something else: suspicion, hidden anger. "Everything's fine," I replied just as coldly as he did. "Just met up with an old friend." James got up from the chair and slowly walked towards me. There was a certain weariness in his movements, but his eyes burned with something deep and dark, something I had been trying to avoid for the past few months. He stopped at the table, and I felt the tension in the room intensify again, almost palpable, like the air before a storm. "An old friend," he repeated, looking straight into my eyes. "How long have you not seen each other?" His question was simple, but the answer to it seemed complicated. I took a deep breath, understanding that this conversation would quickly escalate into something more than just words. "More than 10 years, I answered without averting my gaze, although inside me, a feeling of anxiety was growing. "And you decided to meet him today?" His voice was cold, but not without emotion. It was like ice in which a volcano was hidden. I nodded, not knowing what else to add. There were too many questions, and the answers to them were too complicated. James looked at me with a long, piercing gaze, and I felt his suspicions creeping under my skin, like the cold wind from the swamps. He knew that there was something more in this meeting than I wanted to admit. But as long as he didn't say it out loud, I could pretend that everything was still under control. "Lily," he said, breaking the silence that had become unbearable, "do you think I don't notice anything?" I didn't answer right away. His words hit me like rolls of thunder in the silence of the night. In the room, tension hung, and I felt that this moment could change everything. "What are you talking about?" I tried to speak calmly, but I knew it was useless. James took a step closer, and I felt my hands begin to tremble. He wasn't angry, but there was something in his gaze that I couldn't ignore. It was pain, disappointment, and hidden rage. "We lost touch a long time ago, Lily. You know it, as do I. But now, something has changed, hasn't it?" I was silent. His words echoed in my head, and I couldn't find an answer. Inside me, a storm of emotions raged: guilt, anger, fear. I knew he was right. We had long ceased to be the people connected by love. but to admit it meant facing the truth that I had been running from all these years. "I don't know what you want to hear," I finally forced out of myself. "Yes, we've changed. I've changed. And you too." James looked at me with a long gaze, and I saw pain flickering in his eyes. He knew that I no longer belonged to him, even if he couldn't say it out loud. This was a moment of truth, but I wasn't ready to accept it. "What do you want to do with this?" he finally asked, his voice tired, as if he already knew the answer. I didn't know what to answer. The silence that followed James's question was deafening. In it, as if our entire marriage was contained, all our unsaid words, all the moments when we avoided the truth. I looked into his eyes, but I couldn't find an answer. We stood on the brink of an abyss, and I understood that the next phrase could change our lives forever. I took another sip of wine, feeling the cold sweat on my forehead. The wine didn't help. It only emphasized the sharpness of what was happening inside me. I wanted James to return to me the version of myself that I once knew, for him to take on part of the guilt for this destruction. But most of all, I was afraid that he had long since reconciled with the fact that I was not the woman he once tied his life to. "I don't know," I finally whispered, lowering my eyes. My voice was weak, almost helpless. James sighed. His hand reached for the glass standing on the table, but he didn't take it. Instead, he stopped, as if weighing his next actions, and I saw his lips tighten into a thin line. "You know, Lily," he began, and I felt his words hanging over me like a storm cloud. "I always knew this moment would come. Maybe I even waited for it." "What do you mean?" I tensed, feeling that his words could reveal something I hadn't noticed before. He slowly turned his head to me, his gaze empty, cold, as if he had long since distanced himself from those feelings that once connected us. In his eyes, there was no longer anger or pain, only fatigue. "Do you think I didn't see how you've changed? How everything has changed between us?" His voice sounded like the rustling of dried leaves. "Do you think I'm blind?" His words were like a punch in the gut. I felt everything inside me tighten, but I couldn't find an answer. He was right. We both knew it, but I wasn't ready to hear it so directly. All these years, I tried to keep our marriage afloat, pretending that we could still find a way to each other. But it was a deception, not only for him, but also for myself. I didn't want to say it earlier because I thought we could fix everything, that you could love me again. His voice trembled, and I felt something inside me break. I clenched my fists under the table, trying to hold back the tears that were ready to flow. This was not just a conversation about us, about what went wrong. It was an admission that everything was over. I looked at the man who had been by my side for so many years and realized that I no longer knew him. "And now what?" I asked, trying to keep the despair out of my voice. "What do you want to do with this?" He fell silent, his eyes lowered to the glass that remained untouched. I felt every breath in the room becoming heavier. This was the moment when everything became finally clear. He no longer intended to fight for us. But worse than that was the fact that I was no longer ready for this fight. "I can't make you stay with me if you've already left," he finally said, looking away. His voice was barely audible, but in those words lay all the bitterness of our breakup. He didn't want to admit it out loud, but we both knew that our marriage was over. I couldn't find the words. My throat was dry, and my thoughts were like cracks in glass, broken, chaotic, but inevitable. I loved James. I loved the person he was and, perhaps, even the person he had become. But most of all, I loved the idea that we could be together, despite everything. I stood up from the table, feeling my legs slightly buckle under the weight of what was happening. I knew I had to leave, that our paths had diverged, but this didn't make the decision any easier. I took my glass of wine and headed for the door, feeling his gaze piercing my back. "Lily," James called me, and in his voice, there was something desperate that stopped me in my tracks. "Do you think you will change something, Carter?" His question made me freeze. I felt something heavy settle on me. I knew he knew, and that was the most painful thing. Not the fact that I had met Carter, but the fact that James knew that there was more in this meeting than I wanted to admit. "I don't know," I replied, not turning to him. My voice trembled, and I tried not to cry. With those words, I went outside, closing the door behind me. The cold wind hit my face, reminding me that the storm was still hanging over us. I headed to the car, feeling my heart torn between guilt and unexpressed anger. The swamps of Louisiana had always seemed to me something constant, immovable, but now they seemed just as uncertain as my life. When I got behind the wheel, drops of rain began to fall on the windshield and fog rose from the ground, as if emphasizing my vague thoughts. I looked at my reflection in the mirror and suddenly realized that I no longer recognized the woman I saw. The rain intensified, and the roads of Louisiana, already covered with a wet veil, became almost impassable. I drove on autopilot, not paying attention to the winding lines of the highway. My thoughts were chaotically racing, but they all returned to one thing, to what had happened over the past few hours. James knew about Carter. And even if he didn't say it out loud, his words and gaze said more than just a simple admission. Everything fell into place. I knew where I was going, although I had never consciously made that decision. I turned off the main road onto an old, forgotten path leading to the lake, to a small house that stood apart, hidden by trees and fog. Carter's house. We hadn't agreed to meet. But tonight, everything had to happen. The car stopped in front of the house, the headlights illuminating the old steps leading to the porch. Everything looked just as it had many years ago when we were young and dreamed of a different future. The light in the window was on, and I felt my heart beat faster. I knew that if I stayed here any longer, I might make a mistake that I couldn't fix. The door opened before I could knock. Carter stood on the threshold, his figure illuminated by the dim light from inside. He didn't say a word, just looked at me as if he had been waiting for this moment all his life. And maybe it was true. I stepped inside, feeling the fine droplets of rain sliding down my hair and shoulders. In the house, it was warm, even too warm for such a night. But inside me, there was a chill, a dull feeling of emptiness that wouldn't go away despite all expectations. "Lily," Carter said softly, closing the door behind me. His voice was so familiar that for a moment I felt like I was decades younger, back to the time when we were together.
I didn't know what to say.
In his eyes, I saw a reflection of what we both knew, that our lives had intertwined and shattered at the same time. He took a step closer to me, and I felt his scent, a mixture of tobacco and something warm, familiar, something that connected us once when everything was simpler. "I can't go back," I whispered, looking into his eyes. My words were not quite an admission, but not a justification either. It was what I felt, a point of no return. Carter came closer to me, his hand resting on my back, and I felt the tension that had been building all this time beginning to dissolve. His touch was warm, and at that moment, I realized that I could no longer restrain myself. "You don't have to," he said softly, his voice low, gentle, like the rustling of the swamp outside the window. He leaned closer to me, and at that moment, the whole world seemed to disappear. We met in a kiss filled with all that we had been hiding all these years. This moment was filled with passion that we had both suppressed for so long. It was inevitable, like everything that had led us here. I knew that I could no longer restrain my desires, that all my struggle was over. The kiss was long, passionate, filled with the weight of all the years we had spent apart. We were like two parts of a whole that had finally come together, despite all the obstacles that stood between us. His hand slid over my body, and I couldn't resist this feeling anymore. I was here, with him, in this moment, and nothing else mattered. But even in this moment, I couldn't completely forget about James. His image stood before me like a shadow that I couldn't chase away. Guilt spread within me, mixing with desire. I knew this was a betrayal. But deep down, I had long since committed this betrayal, long before tonight. Carter led me deeper into the house, and we both collapsed onto the couch, completely giving in to the moment. Every kiss, every touch was like proof that we had finally allowed ourselves to be together. We didn't say a word, there was no need. Everything that could have been said was said by our bodies. When the passion finally subsided, we lay together, covered in sweat and each other's breath. In the silence, I heard only our breathing and the sound of rain still beating against the windows. I felt torn between two worlds, the one I had left and the one that might never become real. What now? I whispered, looking at the ceiling, not daring to turn to Carter. This question was more for myself than for him.
He didn't answer right away.
I felt his hand resting on my shoulder and his fingers slowly sliding over my skin. He also knew that everything had changed and the way back was gone. I don't know, he finally said, and in his voice, I heard the same bewilderment that I felt in myself. But whatever it is, we are no longer the people we were before. Those words pierced me. I realized that everything we had done tonight was inevitable, but it didn't bring relief, didn't solve our problems. I had betrayed James, betrayed my past life, but this new life that I sought with Carter couldn't fill the void inside me. I stood up from the couch, feeling the weight on my shoulders. My life had fallen apart, but this didn't make the decision any easier. I put on my clothes, feeling my resolve beginning to dissolve. Inside me, a fire had ignited that I had long tried to extinguish. I have to go, I said softly, not looking at him. My hands were trembling as I took my bag, but inside, I felt the tension gripping me, not allowing me to leave. Carter didn't try to stop me. He knew that this moment was only the beginning of something much more complicated. We both knew it. When I went outside, the rain was still pouring with the same force, and fog enveloped the lake. I headed to the car, feeling my heart torn between guilt and uncertainty. A storm raged within me, and I didn't know what awaited me next, but one thing was clear. I could no longer go back. I was no longer the woman I had been before.